think we'll start. Hi, everybody. My name's Andrea Coomber. I have the enormous privilege of being the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. I'm really pleased that you've chosen to join us this afternoon to talk about some kind of initial thoughts about the findings of the independent sentencing review that reported a few weeks ago. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before we start. First of all, this event is being recorded. So please keep that in mind with things you put into the box, that so it can be shared with people who are unable to join us today. We have two boxes for you at the bottom of your screen. One of them is a chat box. Please feel free to pop in there any thoughts you have, say who you are, what your interest in this is, anything you'd like to share with the other people on the group. The other is the Q&A box. That's the box that we will use for questions when that time comes a little later in the session. So we can't actually see you all, so you need to use the chat box if you want to say hello or share any of those other thoughts. But any questions, please, into the Q&A box. As is ever the case in these events, the questions start very slowly, and then by the time we come to close, we have 20 questions that we haven't been able to answer because they've all come in the last 5 minutes. So please do try to get your questions in early so the panelists have an opportunity to think about them. We have obviously, oh, sorry, I haven't finished it all. Other things I've got to say. Oh, do feel free to tweet about the event using our hashtag Howard League Spotlights, or tag the Howard League, which is at the Howard League, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Apologies, I'm not much of a social media person, so I forget that. In terms of what today is about, obviously sentencing is one of the priorities for the Howard League. It has been since we adopted our new strategy a couple of years ago, and we obviously prepared a report with some senior judges in September of last year talking about sentencing inflation. We've briefed, along with lots of others in the sector, about the sentencing review. We have been engaging directly with the sentencing review and with ministers around the issues raised in it. And there's much to be welcomed. The effort to bring down the prison population, particularly at a time when we know that prisons are overcrowded, that the prison estate can't be built quick enough to be able to accommodate everybody who gets sentenced by courts to custody. Really, dealing with sentencing is the only option the government has. And there is much in this review, I think, that we can talk about, and that is welcome. There's talk of reframing the purposes of sentencing, of generally reducing the use of imprisonment, a reduction in use of short sentences. But I think there are also lots of questions and a fair bit of disappointment about some of what was excluded from the purview of the review, most notably sentences for murder and the IPP sentence, and what still goes untouched, what the review doesn't really kind of substantively deal with. I've spent this morning at a prison with a group of men serving life sentences. There's nothing in this for them, and yet they are serving extraordinarily long sentences. That is obviously murder sentencing having been kind of pushed over for the Law Commission to consider in a year or two's time. We had an interim report that spoke of sentence inflation and the drivers of higher sentences, and yet there's nothing in this report that really deals with tariff length at all, which seems like a missed opportunity. The government's already accepted, sort of explained that it doesn't intend to accept everything in the report. It said, for example, that it's not going to adopt recommendations with respect to extended determinate sentences, for example. And there's generally just a lot of uncertainty. We'll see legislation probably in the autumn, but not coming into effect until next spring. But there's lots in this to discuss, and I'm really thrilled to have a panel, a kind of internal panel to the Howard League with a special guest today. So we have our campaigns director, Andrew Neilson. We have Revolving Doors, our friend from Revolving Doors, Kelly Grehan, who's policy manager there. And obviously Revolving Doors is a leading charity that deals with people in that cycle of crisis and crime. And our own Tim Kerr, who leads on membership for us and has served his own standard determinate sentence years ago, not that long ago, a while ago. So I'm really thrilled to have this panel. We thought we're going to have each of our panelists speak for about 5 minutes and then have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up to the floor from you. So maybe, Andrew, if we can start with you, some thoughts.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to give a quick overview of the review to help contextualise our discussion. I'll pick up on a couple more of the Howard League's concerns, and I thought I'd also mention the spending review briefly, as we've got that today, not just one review, 2 reviews. But the sentencing review first. Obviously, as Andrea was just saying, the review came in 2 parts. The first part, published in February, was an excellent piece of work that identified that society's use of custody had become profligate and unsustainable, identified, as the Howard League has been campaigning on since the government came to power, that sentence inflation is the primary driver in the rise of the prison population. The second part of the review then, which was published last month and was making recommendations off the back of that kind of diagnosis of the problem, has come along. I think it is fair to say it is less ambitious in scope than the first part, and that is partly, as Andrea was just saying, because certain matters, most obviously the sentencing law around murder, were excluded from the review's remit, and that does make tackling sentence inflation particularly hard. There were related issues around longer sentencing, such as the escalation of maximum sentences, the use of mandatory minimum sentences, that were also put aside by the review. I think the phrase that they kept using in that regard was that they did not have enough time to look at those issues properly, and I'm sure to some degree that was true. It was a pretty short timetable the review was asked to respond to, but at the same time, you can't help but feel that that was also a euphemism for these are too politically difficult for us to be looking at right now. In that sense, if the government's use of automatic early release and the changes around SDS 40 and its recent announcements around fixed term recalls, if that has been the emergency short-term response to the prison capacity crisis, then the review's recommendations, as we now have them, form what feel like a short to medium-term response. What we're yet to see, I think, is a long-term, really sustainable solution to the prison capacity crisis. That is not in this review, I fear. At the heart of the review's recommendations are 5 proposals that are estimated to save between 9,000 and 10,000 prison places, and these are, just to quickly run through them, I know Kelly's going to talk about the first in a moment, but curbing the use of short custodial sentences, extending the use of suspended sentence orders, introducing an earned progression model for those on standard determinate sentences. There was also a recommendation for a similar model for those on extended determinate sentences, as Andrea said. The government hasn't accepted that recommendation. And then there was also a recommendation around simplifying recall for those on standard determinate sentences. Even if all those proposals, other than the EDS recommendation, go through and save the prison places they're intended to save, I think we would still expect the government, perhaps, I mean, this would buy the government some time, perhaps 2-3 years before they start to run out of prison places again. And that's where really the lack of ambition comes in. What's worrying about that prospect, of course, is that the government will be closer to the next general election. By then, it will likely have faced the attrition of being in power in the meantime. So there is a fear that the window for making braver choices may already be closing. And meanwhile, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Chancellor had her spending review today. I've had a quick look at that. It's a very quick look because it's just come out. But at first glance, it does look like the Department, the Ministry of Justice, has done okay. Its day-to-day expenditure budget looks to have an average annual real growth of 1.8% over the 5-year period. Rachel Reeves has earmarked £7 billion for the next 5 years to build 14,000 new prison places, and there was a re-announcement, because we've already heard about this, of 700 million per year by 28-29 compared to 25-26 being invested in the probation service. But still, that's 700 million compared to 7 billion. So the probation budget, in other words, is still dwarfed by the capital expenditure alone for new prisons. And I wonder how much of that modest increase in the MOJ's day-to-day departmental expenditure will actually make its way to the prison system, because bear in mind, all those new prison places, 14,000, mean the system will be that bit bigger, about 15% bigger than it is now, for the MOJ's money to be spread around. I'd like to say it's not all doom and gloom, but I would be remiss if I was not to pepper a little more gloom into the mix, because what if the review's recommendations don't work? And I think in one area, there is a real threat that the government will fail to achieve its objective. And that area is the earned progression model for those on SDS. This is the trumpeted third model, where people will be released after a third of their sentence if they stay out of trouble in prison, spend a third of their sentence on license, and a final third on very light touch conditions. That's a very broad brush explanation of what it is about. But this model is meant to deliver the largest savings in terms of prison places, with the review estimating just over 4,000 prison places being saved by the introduction of the earned progression model. Now, the problem is, how will it work in practice? The earned progression isn't based on people doing rehabilitative courses in prison, which I think is a tacit admission that the prison system isn't in a state to deliver those courses at scale. But even staying out of trouble is not a simple matter in prisons that are crippled by rising levels of violence, widespread drug use. I think it's naive to imagine that introducing the model will stop the violence and drugs, that it will simply incentivize people to suddenly live peaceful lives behind bars. And the potential for inequities across different groups of prisoners, or even across different establishments, is quite large. We're particularly worried, for example, about young adults in the system and the likelihood that an earned progression model might be setting them up to fail. At the same time, the government is looking to introduce this and remove automatic early release. And on responding to the review in Parliament, Shabana Mahmood said there would be no maximum on the length of time someone could spend in prison if they failed to be released at the new third way point. And there's a very real prospect, I think, that this could cut the legs off the earned progression model. If large numbers fail to jump through the hoops required, then we might actually start to see prison numbers ticking back up again, and the government forced to rethink the whole thing, and even maybe reintroduce automatic early release in the end. So in other words, the recommendations of the sentencing review are on one level not particularly ambitious, but the cornerstone of what it does recommend, the earned progression model, is in a way pretty ambitious, arguably wildly ambitious, given the current operational challenges faced by a prison system which I think is really on its knees. Now, I want to end very quickly on a positive note as best I can. And I think it's important that what we have at the moment is an incomplete picture. We only have the review to go on and the very early response from government ministers. There is legislation, as Andrea said, to come. There's clearly a lot of operational work going on behind the scenes. The MOJ is very focused, for example, on the future of the probation service and looking again at the workload of probation so that it can handle the increased traffic from custody to the community that the review is envisaging. I'm sure there are people in HMPPS and the MOJ who are well aware of the challenges that an earned progression model brings, and that there will be work being done to try and address them. So for the Howard League and others of us who are on the outside looking in, I think the most important thing is to recognise that the government is at least trying to take meaningful action. We need to be positive, critical friends in that regard. We obviously do need to be asking questions of detail in due course, particularly when legislation is before Parliament, and we need to be looking at pressing the government to go further. There are some signposts to what the government could be doing to go further in the review itself in the final chapter, as well as that first report published in February. So that's the positive note, that the government is at least trying to do the right thing, and we need to push them to do more. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Kelly, can we come to you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So, my name's Kelly. I work for a charity called Revolving Doors. So, we're a national charity. We've been around for about 30 years. And the group that we're particularly concerned with are what we call people who are trapped in the revolving door of crisis and crime. So, people who commit multiple offences because of unmet health and social needs. So, things like addiction, homelessness, um, domestic abuse, often a mixture of all those things. People in this group typically have been excluded from school and or have been in the care system and tend to get a lot of short sentences, which I'll talk about in a second. Just to give a bit of background to me, before I came to the charity sector, I was a probation officer for 20 years. So I have seen the kind of what I will call destruction of the probation service during that time. And I think that feeds into quite a lot of things that are important about short sentences. So what we know about short sentences is that they are used much more than any point previously. In fact, community sentences have fallen in use to about half over the last decade. So lots and lots of people who are getting short sentences at the moment, typically 10 years ago, would have got a community sentence. And I think there's multiple reasons for that. What tends to happen to people that get a lot of short sentences is they end up living a kind of life where they'll go to prison, they'll come out of prison after often weeks. All the thing factors that they had that might have brought them some stability will have fallen apart. So they might have lost any temporary housing they had, lose access to any stabilizing factors such as children or other relatives in that time. And life just deteriorates further and further because of this churn and this cycle of going around short sentences. I think it's also worth saying that the rise in the use of recall we've seen has really added to that chaos that affects people, often doing very short recalls and coming out again to further chaos than they might have experienced previously. So this has all become a big problem for people that are in this group. Um, One of the reasons, I think we need to look at the reasons why short sentences have gone up so much. And I think the initial report really hit the nail on the head when talking about penal populism. When you speak to people, people often think that people get less for an offence now than they would have got 10, 20 years ago, when in fact we absolutely know that the opposite is true. We have this, ridiculous talk about holiday camp prisons. Prisons, in my experience, as someone who's worked in the sector for over 20 years, are actually often in a worse state than they have been in modern times, with prisoners locked up for more than we would have seen 5 or 10 years ago before the pandemic. We've also just seen this chaos in the probation service that came in particularly after transforming rehabilitation, where we now have a lot of probation officers who are very inexperienced and don't have colleagues that have experience to kind of teach them. And being a probation officer is a very, very stressful job. It's a very skilled job, and it's so much harder for people to get those skills now, I would say. Um, Another thing that I think we've really seen, and I think although the sentencing review is really clear about legislating to end short sentences apart from in exceptional circumstances, I think it's really important to look at how that's actually going to happen, because a big fear that we have is that magistrates particularly will see people who've had a couple of community sentences, will see that they didn't finish them or have reoffended despite having them, and will think, well, we've tried everything, so prison is necessary. And that's what has tended to happen over recent times. One of the reasons that I really want to stress is that this has been caused by is a decline in the use of long pre-sentence reports. So just to give you the figures, in 2014, there were 32,000 full PSRs, sometimes known as standard reports, written. By 2023, that had fallen to 4,500. So many people are appearing before magistrates, and the magistrates know very little about them. So just to give you some background for those that don't know, a full pre-sentence report traditionally would be written after a probation officer had spent couple of hours, maybe two interviews with that person, maybe would have spoken to their relatives, would have spoken to key workers, would have got other reports, perhaps from other organisations working with these people. So it would be a really holistic report, and they would have put a long explanation as to why this person might be suitable for a community sentence, even if they'd had 3, 4, 5, 6 before. Now, often reports are written in court on the day the person appears. The person has no opportunity to build any kind of trust or rapport in the person writing the report. And I think as a result, a lot of sentences are happening kind of blind. So a lot of people who clearly are suitable for a community sentence are getting a prison sentence. The magistrate thinks they've got no choice in this circumstance. I think we really need to work hard to make sure that magistrates have the information they need, or I really worry, even with legislation, that we won't see an end for short sentences for people in this group. The other thing I would say is that magistrates just naturally are stuck in a loop of seeing people who've struggled on community sentences and never see the people that have done well by virtue of the fact that they're just not coming back to court. So we need to work on improving those communication lines. The report also talks about increased investment in community treatment orders. I think this is really important because currently those orders, drug treatment orders, sorry, mild probation language, drug and alcohol orders requirements, are really poorly funded. There just aren't enough places. And the big thing that we see constantly is people who do receive those requirements for treatment have already been returned to court on something else by the time that would have kicked in. So they may be waiting 6 weeks for mental health treatment or 8 weeks for drug treatment or whatever it is. And for a person in chaos, that's a lifetime. We can all imagine what that's like. So I'm really interested to see what the increased investment in those looks like and how that works out. We were really pleased to see the promise to, or the proposal, sorry, to launch a public awareness of sentencing campaign. As I said, this will be hugely, potentially hugely beneficial to people who are caught in cycles of crisis and crime, because looking at our group, who are often known as prolific offenders, and sometimes worse things, there's a narrative that has built up around this group, particularly in relation to shoplifting, but other offences as well, where people are demonized rather than the situations they are in, which are often very, very poor situations that are not of the person's own making, that are very difficult to get out of. I think that if the public understood them, there will be a lot more empathy. I think actually when you explain to the public, and polling does consistently show this, why people commit lower level offences and how people are caught in cycles of crime, people do have the empathy and really want those people to get help. There's lots of pilots taking place around the country, particularly in some police and crime commissioner areas, that really show that things can work, really strong interventions can work, and that the public do support them. So I think that's a really, really good thing. The other thing we were quite excited about was the deferred sentencing recommendations. Now, deferred sentencing is really strange. We don't keep any statistics on how many people get a deferred sentence, which I think is one of the oddest things I've come across. Judges in the main, I think, from speaking to them, really like deferred sentences because they like the opportunity to see someone go off and do well, and particularly with a court backlog. We know lots of people appear in court in very different circumstances to those when they committed an offence. So often a person might get to court and say, I've really been dealing with my drug problem, or I've finally got the help I need. And I think often judges are really keen to let people continue on that path and say, all right, come back in 6 months or 12 months and we'll see how you're getting on. So I'm really hopeful that we'll see a lot more use of deferred sentencing and that we'll actually know how many people have them. And I think that's really important. So overall, I think there was a lot of good things in the sentencing review, but as always, the devil is in the detail, and we need to see how these translate partly in legislation, but partly also onto the ground. Our members were very fortunate. All of our work is driven by our lived experience members, who are all people that have recent experience of being in crisis and crime. And we were very privileged that we met with David Gauke and some of the people on the review to talk about those experiences, and that I think that's one thing that's really positive about the review, is it has been based on so much consultation, particularly people who've lived experience of the justice system. So onwards and upwards, I think we are hopeful but cautious about what might be ahead. And now I'll hand back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Kelly. Loads in there for questions and comment later. And finally, Tim, do you want to tell us what you think, what we're hearing on the ground?
So hello, I'm Tim. I'm the membership officer at the Howard League. So I correspond with our 300 plus members within prison. And as many on the call might have been involved with, there was a call for evidence for this sentencing review. So we wrote to all of our members and asked for them to tell us what they thought and what they wanted us to include in our response. And I have them all here. We were inundated with many letters. So I'll go through, we asked them 4 questions which were put into the review, and I'll sort of briefly summarize in 5 minutes the collective experience of all our members. So first we asked how we should reform the use of community sentences and alternatives to custody. Overwhelmingly, our members supported the idea that there shouldn't be sentencing below 12 months, which we've seen borne out in the review. So our members will be pleased with that. There was a lot of call for more tailored support. So, people with drug addiction problems should receive sentences or community sentences that treat their drug addiction. There was lots of issues surrounding housing, people being sent to prison because they don't have a house or an abode to live in. So calls for more support for those to get housing to prevent them being put into the criminal justice system. We then asked how should custodial sentences be reformed, and we included recall in that question. And that was the biggest kind of response we got from our members, was the sort of overuse of recall. The sentencing review report notes the statistic that recall has doubled from 6,000 people to 13,500 people being on recall between 2018 and 2025. So clearly the lived experience of our members and the official statistics both bore out this idea that recall is being used a lot more widely than it has previously, and that's really contributing to the kind of overcrowding and large prison population we're seeing now. Our members fairly overwhelmingly felt that the recall process wasn't fair, and that their probation officers would be, quote, trigger happy and recall too easily for things such as missing appointments or quite minor non-offences, really breaches of their licence conditions, potentially human error in a lot of cases. And a lot felt that this process could be improved by making it more of a judicial process, so going through some more official court process rather than relying on an individual probation officer. So while recall is mentioned in the Gauke review, it's certainly not been taken up to the extent that our members would appreciate. They also talked about within prison wanting more positive environments. So notably prisons like Dovegate and Oakwood have wings and programs where sort of positive behaviour is rewarded, and they're more sort of rehabilitative environments, and that's not certainly the case in many of the prisons up and down the country. And so the idea of rewarding good behaviour, as the report is really pushing, might really struggle to be implemented in a lot of prisons. Next, we asked how we should reform the way offenders progress through their sentences. And Andrew touched on the earned progression system of, going from custody to a community sentence and so on. But many of our members were worried about progression through the categories. So you start prison in a usually category B prison, and you might complete your sentence plan there and then be stuck waiting to be recategorized, or even you might be recategorized but don't then have an ability to move to a lower category prison. And equally, the bigger bottleneck is probably waiting for positions in open prisons. So that's something our members are really were keen to push through. And again, they mentioned a lot, it's quite hard to behave if you're in a category that's too severe for you, and equally quite dispiriting if you've completed your sentence plan or rehabilitative work and then are not allowed to move to the next stage because of backlogs and bottlenecks within the system. And finally, we asked what changes would be needed to meet the individual needs of specific offender groups. A lot of our members mentioned the plight of older prisoners within the system. So broadly, the prisons are not set up for people with multiple chronic healthcare conditions, and people, well into their 80s or 90s being held in prisons, perhaps unwarranted. There's touched on briefly in the Gauke report that they'll be looking to perhaps increase the use of compassionate release for those really infirm older prisoners, and possibly improving the healthcare facilities within prisons. A lot of two groups of prisoners that maybe aren't, as has been mentioned, given much attention in the report would be life sentence prisoners, who again demonstrate quite a low reoffending risk once released, but ultimately end up with incredibly long sentences waiting in prison, waiting to be released. And again, that struggle to maintain good behaviour when surrounded by people that aren't on that sort of level. And finally, sexual offenders were felt to be treated sort of fairly homogeneously, but obviously there's quite a spectrum of those convicted of sexual offences and need more sort of specific, tailored rehab or sentences that maybe hasn't been touched upon in the Gauke review. So I'll maybe stop there.
Thanks, Tim. One quick question from me for Kelly. I mean, one of the I think pluses of this report has been welcomed is with respect to women in prison who are disproportionately serving shorter sentences. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what this might mean for women in prison.
We're hoping it's good news. Unfortunately, we've kind of been here before where we've seen a lot of policy directed at women and we haven't seen it really bear fruit. So I'm being a bit cautious on this. I was particularly cheered to see the mention of women's centres. We know that it's a very mixed picture of women's centres across the country. For women who end up in the revolving door, they have, unsurprisingly, a particularly hard time of it. They're much more likely to have no accommodation. They're much more likely to lose access to their children. We absolutely know that the remand population for women makes no sense at all. Most women that are on remand have not committed any violent offences. So with the developments with the Women's Justice Board, I think we should be hopeful that we'll see some change. But we're 20 years on now from the Corston report. I recall reading the Corston report and thinking we'll see change soon, and we haven't got even close to it yet. So I think we need to be cautious about what the future holds for women in the system. And unfortunately, I think going back to the points we see about penal populism, the view that the public are given by the media about women who are in the justice system in comparison to the truth is so stark. Like the difference is so different. The vast majority of women in the system have been victims of domestic abuse or other types of abuse, all those kind of factors. And until we start really being clear that we're addressing that rather than going for punishment, I will remain concerned. And I think the furore we saw around the Sentencing Council recommendations, many of which related to women, has really worried me, and I'm sure worried everyone else. So, as I say, we hope for the best, but I think it's a bit early to be optimistic about what the future.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem a bit early to be kind of pinpointing women's prisons to be closed because everyone's going to be getting out easily.
Absolutely.
Andrea, I wonder if you had any thoughts about recall. Obviously, that was one of the kind of, we're going through a bit of a recall roundabout at the moment with different sort of processes being adopted by government with respect immediately now to short-term recall, and then the proposal for fixed-term recall in the sentencing reviews approach. Is there anything on that you'd like to talk about?
Sorry, was that for me or for Andrew?
No, it's for Andrew.
Oh.
Sorry.
Sorry, I thought it was for Kelly.
No.
I mean, I suppose our primary concern at the moment is that we have seen just through the SDS 40 measures, people being recalled, and arguably that being counterproductive to the kind of desired objective of that policy. Now there are changes afoot, which are partly, I mean, this is the interesting thing is, I talked about an incomplete picture, and I think this is part of that incomplete picture because there are things in the review about simplifying recall. There were the changes that Shabana we just announced in the meantime because prison capacity was looking tight again. But going on behind the scenes, meanwhile, there is this work on the future of the probation service, some of which I think you can kind of discern within the sentencing review. So how that has interacted, it's an independent review, and meanwhile the MOJ is doing internal work on the future of the probation service, how these two things have quite interacted is not entirely clear. But it's interesting, for example, that I know for a fact that thinking about whether we actually need to, abolish the rehabilitation activity requirement, which is a hangover from transforming rehabilitation, was definitely something that was in the kind of conversation amongst officials when it comes to looking at probation's workload and how you manage that going forward. And sure enough, it's there in the review as a recommendation that we should move away from that. So that kind of work that's being done around how probation actually operates, and recall is clearly a big part of that, because I think the concern at times has been that recall sometimes has been used because actually the probation service itself is under the pressure that it is. The caseloads are so high that perhaps if staff had more time and resource to hand to actually investigate cases and see whether a recall was necessary, then they might not have gone down that road. So the two things are really enmeshed, and that's why it's difficult to assess how this is going to play out when there is a lot of operational work being done that we can partly see and we partly can't see at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of people in the chat have commented about encouraging sort of messages from the review around the importance of probation and the importance of providing support and treatment to people in the community. But all of that only occurs if you've got a probation service that is appropriately supported. I see we've got a question. Is it a question or one of the comments is from Ian Lawrence, who's the head of the National Association of Probation Officers. Nice to see you, Ian. Saying, do colleagues agree that the probation service needs investment now to stabilise the already beleaguered staff? I'm guessing that you're getting a resounding support from us on that, Ian.
Yes, it's worth saying there though, so the 700 million, again, difficult to discern at the moment, partly because we've got this incomplete picture, which is based on what's in the review, the initial political response, and then what's going on behind the scenes. But that initial political response in itself can be arguably slightly distorting. So a lot of the if you just went by what ministers have been saying off the back of the review's recommendations, then quite a bit of that 700 million would apparently is just going to be spent on electronic monitoring rather than on probation staffing. Now, whether that's actually just the way that it's being spun, because that's seen as the best way of talking about it, or whether we'll see more actual investment in staff, I think remains to be seen. But I come back to that point I made about the spending review today, where £7 billion of capital expenditure has been earmarked for new prisons, and that suddenly makes that 700 million. The ambition of spending a 700 million extra a year by the end of the spending review period on probation seem quite a small beer.
Kelly, any thoughts on probation?
Many thoughts. It won't surprise you. So when I became a probation officer nearly 25 years ago, myself, all my colleagues, I think that came into the job, saw it as a vocation and a real opportunity to have a job where you could make a difference. Our training wasn't perfect, but we had 2 years of being trained before we would work with people who were deemed high risk or really complex. Probation officers now, in my experience, are burnt out very quickly because of the expectations of the job at such an early stage. There isn't time for reflection. So although there is a lot of talk about a recruitment crisis in probation, I think the bigger problem is the retention crisis. And I think when you speak to probation officers, they just talk really about being in a state of permanent anxiety. We did a short survey recently, which NAPO helped with, asking probation officers why they thought, for example, recall had gone up so exponentially. And without exception, people said fear of serious further offences, real kind of fear of, I would say, being thrown to the wolves if they were the officer who supervised something where something went wrong, or someone where something went wrong. So we need to start treating probation officers as professionals, training them properly, and actually all the time people spend on paperwork is time they're not spending with people on their caseload. What motivates people that go into the probation service is to spend time helping people with rehabilitation, resettlement. All of that stuff has been pushed further and further aside to make sure that every decision is defensible and is recorded as being defensible. And I think until we get that right, we'll continue to hemorrhage probation staff, which is a tragedy actually, because when you speak to people who have had a really good relationship with their probation officer, they will talk and talk about the difference it has made to them, about how they can't thank that person enough, and that's why people go into probation. So what's really sad is we absolutely know all the answers about what works for people on probation, and we're just not following them for various typically political reasons.
Yeah, I have to say one of the saddest days I've had at the Howard League was speaking at the NAPO conference last year, and just seeing how broken a lot of who have been in service for years and have previously loved their jobs, and find it inordinately stressful with ridiculous workloads and a lot personally on the line. It was
and frustratingly knowing like all this person needs is X, or this could make that real, and not being able to deliver it is tragic.
Yeah, I mean, as one of them said to me, I just need to be able to refer this person to housing. There is no housing.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ian. I hope that answers your question. We've got lots and lots of other questions. So we'll try to start going through them. We have about half an hour. So Jonathan's asked a question around the rebalancing statement of policy at the beginnings as the first part of the sentencing review, which I think we would all kind of agree with, that it's not just about punishment, it's also about crime reduction, public protection, reparation and rehabilitation. And will the Secretary of Justice, Secretary of State make that rebalance happen? Andrew, this question's for you. What can the sector be doing? I mean, I think it might also kind of link in with a question that James has asked a little bit further down, which is about the kind of political response to the sentencing review, which my assessment was it seemed that the Secretary of State was welcoming sentencing review with sort of gritted teeth, and other political parties with shrieks of silence, other than Robert Jenrick. But Andrew, your thoughts on the rebalancing, or how are the other parties doing?
Well, on the rebalancing, I mean, we'll have to see what the legislation, how the legislation responds to the recommendation there, and then also how policy follows through, because it's all very well to have a change in the legislation on the statutory purposes, but I think Janet Carter later on in one of the questions mentions that if you followed through the kind of reordering of priorities, then perhaps, for example, the statutory requirement to impose a punishment requirement in every community order would be revoked, because that feels like it's kind of old school, although it's not that old a change actually, but old school in the sense of the way that the priorities are currently listed on the political response. I mean, I suppose that's the way that we have to. It's a glass half full, glass half empty kind of question, in the sense of how you then view the review. Because I was quite down on the review in my opening remarks, I suppose, having been quite positive about it in helping to draft our initial press response to it. And that's, I suppose, because in that initial press response, we were very aware of the political kind of dynamics that the review was landing in, which are not helpful. They are often hostile. Party politics is not helpful here. We've heard about penal populism, and that was a theme in the first part of the review. And the way that the review's findings, I mean, you know, most people, I suspect, in the general public will not be aware of what the review has recommended. But if there's one thing that they might be aware of, then it's something to do with chemical castration, because that's the way that the media stories came out, and it was probably spun that way, frankly, by the Ministry of Justice. Interesting question as to why they would do that. You know, what that tells you is that you know, it's very difficult to get kind of rational, evidence-based policy making across the line. And as we've seen in the kind of already just the process with the review, both it being conceived, commissioned, and then being delivered, ambitions for what evidence-based policy making that can be achieved are already starting to be reined back. And that's before we even get to really the big underlying long-term issues that need to be solved and are not in the end ultimately going to be solved by this review.
Kim, do you have any thoughts on that? Because we often get letters about the politics of prison from our members.
Well, I'd comment on the punishment idea that I think if punishment is to be effective, it should be consistent. And currently prisons or sentencing don't really achieve consistent punishment. Your time in HMP Wandsworth would be quite different from your time in HMP Oakwood, for example. And think you know all the clamour that was made about pre-sentencing reports potentially not being equal, but very little attention is drawn to the fact that you know the punishment aspect of sentencing in prisons is very unequal at the moment. And if it's unequal, it can't really have a sort of consistent effect on those being sentenced. So that would be my sort of quick reflection on punishment there. And being in prison as our members are now, and as I was, you're you know acutely aware of the politics going on. I mean, I almost became radicalized, you know, to politics. I was watching Politics Live each day in prison and reading Guardian newspaper each day and so on, because these decisions made by politicians really touch your day-to-day life, and there'll be a lot of angst, I imagine, at the moment amongst our, you know, anyone in prison with these changes going on. The prison rumour mill will be swirling. We've seen lots of concerns over changes to the EDS sentences, because obviously what's proposed in the review might not be taken up by government. So I think, yeah, the politics probably will generate a lot of sort of angst and uncertainty within prisons, and there'll be felt to be quite a lot of sort of unfairness going on. Some people will, you know, benefit from this sentencing review perhaps, but a lot of people won't.
Yeah, I mean, even just walking around Wings this morning, there are a lot of questions about what does it mean for me? When's it coming in? I hear it's coming in September. No, it's not coming. Like it's you know, it's big news, and this really affects. I mean, we as I mentioned to the panel before we began the webinar, we had an email from one of our members. He's in open prison the day that that the government ruled out following the recommendations on EDS. And for that particular person, they've got a 17-year sentence. The difference between going to the parole board at 50% and going to the parole board at 2/3 of their sentence is a question of years in the community, when they have been working since day one of their sentence to make restoration and to change their life and to do everything that they need to do to be released, but to not even get the opportunity to go to the parole board, as has been rejected so far by the government. I think Lorna's asked a question about that. Is that final, or is there room to influence the government on that recommendation? I mean, it's definitely something that we will continue to push for. My personal view, we've not come to a Howard League position on this, is that while it seemed that there was a pretty blanket rejection of it initially, if it does come to pass that the prison population does not come down in the way it's anticipated it will come down through other measures, then the safe release of people by the parole board slightly earlier in their sentence does seem a way, given how many people, 10,000 people on EDSs in this country, that does seem a way of getting prison population down. Like, that's a way of bringing numbers down. So it may be that the government would revisit that at some stage, but they've certainly said that, I mean, they've made it clear that that wouldn't be in the initial legislation. There are any other questions on that? Going through that. What do we expect next steps to be? Formal government response to Gauke, white paper, straight to a bill. Review of the Sentencing Council included. Andrew, that all sounds like you.
I think that's Rob Allen, isn't it?
Yeah, it is Alan.
Yes, hi Rob. I think we're going to see it go straight to a bill, because I don't think the government has time to go through the kind of official response kind of route. I think, again, that is partly, sorry to say that phrase, incomplete picture again, but I think that is, again, part of the frustrating incomplete picture, is that I think we're going to jump from the review to legislation without perhaps an interim stage where there might be some kind of consultation from government on what it's going to do in response to the review. So that is a bit of a challenge. On the Sentencing Council, I think that review is separate. It will be conducted on a separate track, but what is possible is that if anything came out of that review that required legislation, then there is, I suppose, a ready-made legislative vehicle in whatever the bill is called that is introduced to Parliament for the next session in response to the review, the sentencing review, that is.
There are a few questions here around life sentence prisoners. Murder was excluded from the sentencing review's terms of reference. So the government has indicated that it will be considering asking the Law Commission to look at murder convictions and sentences, and they'll do that in the next, over this course of this Parliament, is the expectation. They've also sort of said that joint enterprise would be considered, for those of you who are asking, as part of that joint enterprise murder. But that is not part of the current plans for sentencing reform. More questions. All right, some of these questions are really long, people. Shorter questions. Phil Walsh has asked a question about sexual suppressants. I mean, I certainly don't know enough about sexual suppressants to be able to answer that question around safeguards. I mean, I think it's worth noting that the sentencing review's recommendation with respect to chemical suppressants was purely that there be more kind of investigation into them. It wasn't that they be rolled out more. That was, as Andrew said, I mean, presumably something that came from the Ministry of Justice on the day after the review as a way of diverting attention away from other things. But there is no such thing as chemical castration. It is chemical suppression. It's undertaken at the moment on a voluntary basis by people in a good number of prisons across the country, and it is helpful. And there's, I think, a fair bit of research that it does work for a lot of people, but it's very hard to imagine how that would work in a mandatory way, as the Secretary of State has suggested. She might want to explore that. It is certainly very difficult to imagine how that could be done legally in a lawful manner. And I think, having spoken to some psychiatrists about it, in a way that is consistent with the ethical, moral, professional codes of psychiatrists and doctors in prescribing, because you need to prescribe for the individual person. You can't prescribe for public protection. So I think we're trying not to give too much oxygen to all of that for the time being. It may well be that the government decides to roll it out, in which case we will be having to look at it. Gillian's, Gillian's asked a question here, Andrew, about MOJ on probation. The overall strategy is, what is the level of incarceration expected to be? 10 to 20 years.
So so Gillian refers to the fact I talked about, the work going on behind the scenes around the future of probation. That work, my understanding is that work really is looking at the next 2 years, 2 to 3 years, and it is very much the focus is on the fact that even before we had the Gauke review and the recommendations that one way or another involve a shift of burden, partly from custody to the community, even before any of that. So, for example, restricting the use of short prison sentences, which would, one imagines, mean more community orders. Even before that, Patients Service is already massively working over capacity. I mean, the Howard League for many years has talked about overcrowding in prisons, but we've also talked about overcrowding in probation, which is the less visible overcrowding. And we've already referred to that today. And so the work the MOJ is doing is partly about reducing that workload in anticipation of probation being asked to do more due to the sentencing review. So that work is pretty much to quite a tight time scale and is looking to realise some positive change for probation service in the next couple of years. Gillian's question is asking, well, what about longer term change? and I kind of tend to. So I've lost the question in the chat. That's strange. It was in front of me a moment ago. I think whenever people ask questions, it kind of moves the screen. But from memory, from what I could read of that question, it was saying, well, what about longer term thinking? Well, I'm not aware of the timescale that I think Gillian mentioned, 10 to 20 years being on anybody's radar, really, which is, I think, indicative of the problems that the department faces, that even thinking 5 years ahead feels like a luxury to the Ministry of Justice often, when they are facing these day-to-day crises in the prison system.
I mean, I think it's worth sort of reiterating that this is a question of sort of crisis management, like perhaps slightly medium-term crisis management, but there's nothing in this that deals with overcrowding of prisons. This also presupposes the continuation of overcrowded prisons. You know, the 22,000 people who are sharing a cell intended for a single person will still be sharing a single cell on the back of this. This is just how to fill the prisons up in a way that there's enough prison spaces for people coming in. You know, that's the business we're in at the moment. There's not a strategy at all that we can see or we've heard of from government, despite sort of talking to them about this, about, you know, what does the longer term and what is the longer term ambitions in terms of overcrowding and prison conditions talk about. Kelly, there's a question here about how to ensure the public confidence in community alternatives. Perhaps you might want to answer now.
That's a great question. So as I said, I think the real problem we have is the public only really see sentences that go wrong. Actually, there are some brilliant stories, brilliant examples of community sentences being really transformative. So I hope we start seeing more media focus on sentences that really do bring change. I think it's always been a problem with probation that it only ever gets any focus when something has gone wrong. So I think the public overall have a very slanted, just incorrect view of what probation is. I'd really like to see that changed. I think part of the problem also is that the MOJ and the government and successive governments actually have not been prepared to go and make the argument of why probation works, how it can work, what it does when it works. And unfortunately, the kind of background to the sentencing review is a prime example of that. We're talking about the sentencing review to the public in terms of we've had to do this because of the prison crisis. Actually, why don't we go and make the argument that we're doing this because we want to solve crime by using the methods that we know solve crime. We want to make life worth living for people that are in difficult situations by knowing what works to make life worth living for people. And we want to have less victims by doing what we know works to have less victims. But there's been none of that rhetoric. And unfortunately, I think that is really quite typical of what we've seen with penal policy for generations now.
I mean, it's sad though, isn't it? Because there's a lot of that in the Gauke review.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of like, you know, this will actually work. And that's why we're doing it. We're doing it because it will decrease reoffending. And that means fewer victims of crime. And yet that's not the way it's been received. It's been received as like, you know, we have to do this.
I think it's scandalous to be honest, and it's such a shame because actually what the public love nothing more than is a story of someone who's had difficult times and then goes on to good things, whatever they may be. So it's a real shame that we never see that kind of rhetoric or that kind of argument. And you know, community sentences have been through a hard time in recent years, particularly post-transforming rehabilitation for the reasons we spoke about earlier. But they absolutely can work. They absolutely can be transformative. And for every person that's led a life of crisis and crime and then come out of the other side and led, you know, a good, stable life that they've enjoyed, that's really something to celebrate. And it's such a shame that isn't what we do. You know, nothing brings me more joy as an ex-probation officer than working with our lived experience members now who have kind of been able to break those cycles and go on to good things. There's nothing more joyous than watching that. So any chance I get, that's what I like to say to ministers or MPs because it's just hidden from them, really.
Yeah. There's also a question here or comment here from Janet Carter about community treatment requirements So Janet is one of our members who actually helped with our submission. Should a statutory breach criteria to missed appointments be made more realistic to make this investment worthwhile? Currently, less than 40% can be expected to complete the order. So the new recall criteria might be more realistic for this group, i.e. non-compliance or specific and imminent risk. That's the kind of slightly changing test proposed by the sentencing review. Do you have thoughts on that, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it sounds quite fair, or you miss 2 appointments, but I think we forget that particularly people that are doing mental health treatment requirements and also drug and alcohol requirements, that the chaos that people in those situations with those kind of situations live in, of course they miss appointments. That's obvious. And actually, we're asking a lot of those people to comply with their order, while often the system is not meeting their end of the bargain. So people are waiting weeks, months, however long it might be for that treatment. So I think we should be looking at that. And probation officers used to be quite good at this, and I think that's fallen away a lot because of the kind of the risk averse nature that we've seen creep into probation. People often have missed an appointment for what may not appear a good reason, but because of the crisis in their life. And I think probation officers are trained and should be able to be sympathetic to that. And often when you're in addiction, particularly, you could be doing really well, have a lapse, and then go straight back where you were a week later. The system should be able to recognise that there are lapses involved when you're in treatment for anything. So I would like to see that brought in, and just well, all the rules are there where that can be done. I'd like to see them applied a lot more, and that we look at people holistically, look at their personal situations. I would also say that one of the reasons I think that happens less and less is that people are much less likely to have the same probation officer for the length of their order or license than they were in the past. And if you've got the same officer, they really get to know that person, and that person really gets to know them, and a trust builds up. When you're seeing a different person, how can they possibly make a judgment about whether your behaviour is a blip or whether you're really committed to your recovery? All those sort of things are not possible if you haven't got the same officer. So again, actually, quite often breaching and recall come down to the system letting down the person rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And just quickly, hi to Janet. I know Janet.
Hi, Janet. I'm afraid we're now at the position where we just have so many questions we can't get through them all. There's a question here again, you might have views on it, Kelly, around oh God, where's it gone? The review suggests increased investment in the third sector. What's the panel's response to that, and how might that happen and follow through?
I think it sounds like a great idea. We know there's some absolutely amazing work that goes on with the third sector. I always feel a slight panic because transforming rehabilitation was talked about as charities taking over supervision and things, and we all know what happened there. I think the best kind of supervision or best orders for people on probation often are when probation officers work very, very closely with people in the third sector. The other thing that we always advocate for is for people to have peer support, so support from people who've been through the systems. That really helps people with trust, navigating the systems, with advocacy when people find it very hard to advocate for themselves. So generally, if it's done properly and works well, and these things are properly funded, we can see some real positives of the third sector becoming involved. But I appreciate I've used this phrase about 6 times today. The devil is in the detail, so we'll see how that works out.
Yeah, I'm afraid I share your sort of implicit reservations that it's good to have warm words for the sector, and its government has had warm words for. So they're talking about partnership with the third sector, but the third sector can't live on fresh air and commitment alone. So without the government actually, I was at a pretty depressing thing with the front bench of Labor before Labor was in the beginning of last year, where they kind of all turned up and said, third sector, thank you for this is across all sectors. The third sector, thank you so much for everything that you've done over the last 14 years where the Tories have been running the country, blah, blah. We will be coming in, and we look forward to working with you, but there'll still be no money for you under us. We're just going to be more grateful. It was a very depressing sort of message of we'll appreciate you more, but frankly, just keep on doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
So we have have to hope that there's going to be more in that. And certainly the Gauke review was anticipating a lot more support for the third sector, as well as a lot more support for probation as part of this. Are there particular questions in the question box that members of the panel, given that we're running out of time, are keen to, maybe Andrea, you can talk about the Howard League's doing next, which is a perfectly reasonable question for one of our members, from Jonathan. Oh, there are so many questions here, sorry.
So in terms of what the Howard League is doing next, we actually have a meeting tomorrow at our offices with people from other sector organisations to mull over that question, not just for what the Howard League is going to do, but what we're all going to do. I think the key thing that is on the horizon, as I've mentioned already, is forthcoming legislation. I think it would be helpful to understand where other organisations in the reform space are sitting in regards to the review, what they think is positive, what's negative, how we can engage government going forward, and particularly how we can look at lobbying in Parliament on the legislation. There's obviously government has a big majority, very big majority, so it's definitely going to be going through. I suspect the window for getting positive change through is going to be very limited. When I say that, I mean positive change that the government isn't prepared to back because of that large majority. But there is also, of course, always the scope for people to throw spanners in the work from the backbenches, either opposition or indeed government, and new things being introduced to the bill while it goes through Parliament. That's often, in fact, how we've seen sentence inflation work. So there will be work to be done just firefighting what might be introduced as the bill progresses through the Commons and the Lords.
We've had a number of questions here about remand. Remand is one of our organisational priorities. Obviously, as has been put into this question by a couple of people, there are a lot of people on remand who are then either acquitted by court or are sentenced to less time than they've served. That population, we know, has particularly bad outcomes in terms of self-harm and self-inflicted deaths. And life is very difficult because they don't have sentence plans. They spend sometimes years and years and years. We've had one member who was 4 years in a local jail without a sentence plan, no progression, nothing. So life is very tricky for people on remand. There are, as we understand it, kind of decisions, movements behind the scenes with MOJ, and we've talked to some of the people involved in those decisions about addressing the remand population. But it is so connected to the Crown Court backlog and what's happening in Crown Courts that it is, I think the Ministry of Justice is finding itself in a bit of a bind about it. And in the meantime, we'll continue to advocate for those people. But it's true, Gillian, that there will be fewer people on shorter sentences in some of those local jails, but increasing numbers of people on remand. I think worth remembering that 1 in 4 women in prison is on remand and 1 in 5 men is on remand. So it's a huge chunk of the prison population. And as for your question about what people are being sentenced to, there's nothing in the sentencing review and nothing, I think, in the legislation about the conditions in which people are held in prison, although that is obviously a continuing area of concern and attention for the Howard League, and something that we are talking about all the time is the disgraceful conditions in prison. I was in a prison this morning. I saw some things I did not like, as ever when I go to prisons. Any other quick questions that people want to think that they can answer in 2 minutes?
Yeah, very quickly, there's a question about tagging and the increased use of tagging. What I've really noticed in court recently is that magistrates seem very keen to give everyone a tag, perhaps slight exaggeration, but whether it's really warranted or not. We did some forums with our members recently, and I thought what came out really clearly about tagging for women particularly was a lot of women really felt having a tag made them much more vulnerable. It was like a beacon for people who wanted to exploit them, basically saying this woman is vulnerable. And I think that's something I've never heard really considered by policymakers in the MOJ and such like in terms of that vulnerability. It's something we need to focus on about the harm that's done potentially by tagging in some cases.
Yeah, it reminds me of a comment that Lucy, I think, has put in the chat section, which is about a woman who decided not to serve her whole sentence in custody rather than go out to be recalled. And it's something I've had conversations with IPPs about, who talk about, when they get released again, this is IPPs who've been recalled, saying, when I get released, I'm just not going to leave my house unless I'm with my mum, because they're so worried about local people who don't like them going for them, or the local police, or just generally getting into trouble. And so, they're terrified. They're terrified of what life is like with the threat of recall hanging over your head. So it's very real. And obviously, vast majority of people who are getting recalled are not getting recalled for further offending. They're getting recalled for compliance breaches. And I'm not saying compliance breaches don't indicate risk in some instances, but it's a lot of people now being recalled by a probation service that is, really under a lot of pressure.
Absolutely.
To be clear, probation officers take it personally in the neck if someone goes on to commit serious further offence. In a way, I think the rest of us, don't. There doesn't seem to be that institutional support for probation officers in the way there are for lots of other professions. Some final comments from the panel. Tim, is there anything that you feel like you haven't said that you want to say?
Oh, I'm on the spot there.
Go to someone.
No, my head's gone completely blank. I'm sure there's lots of things our members would want to put forward here, but
You've done a good job of representing their thoughts today, Tim. Thank you.
thank you.
Andrew, final thoughts?
I think I just keep coming back to that the figures from the spending review today, and the 7 billion earmarked for new prisons compared to a commitment to up to 700 million a year for the probation service. That ultimately is the wrong way around if we want to really get to the bottom of the problems that the criminal justice system faces. We need proper investment in the community in order to both prevent crime upstream, but then also, once people are in the criminal justice system, to do a much better job of getting them back out of crime and into the community.
Finally, Kelly.
I really concur with all the points Andrew's just made. I also just want to say how cheering it is to be on a panel where so many people in the chat and the Q&A are so knowledgeable and so invested in justice reform. And I would just urge everybody in the chat who's really interested in these subjects to write to their MP, to share things on social media and really help us across the sector to lobby. It's really heartening to see so many people. Such a high quality of conversation.
It's a huge. I mean, we've got a good number of probation officers, people who are really experts. So thank you for joining us today. If you're not already a member of the Howard League, please do consider becoming a member of the Howard League. If you're a prison leaver, or if you're a family member of somebody in prison, it is free for you. Hopefully nobody in prison is watching this, because I had to tell somebody today they couldn't watch me on their contraband phone. Please do sign up, or sign up to hear more about our events. We have a lot of things coming up. On the 23rd of June, we'll be releasing a report on IPPs. So that's in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, just gone Monday. That was led by Lord Thomas of Coombe, the former Lord Chief Justice, with a truly expert group looking at how to end the legacy of the IPP for good. We think we've come up with something that is politically acceptable. We hope it's politically acceptable. That will actually mean that people can get released. Obviously, we don't want to raise expectations of that for people on the sentence or their family members, because it's a long way, but we think we've come up with something that would be a way of giving finality to people on the sentence. So hopefully the government will take those proposals seriously, along with other proposals in that report. So the report will be coming out on the 23rd of June, and we will be having, as Rob's put into the chat, our next Spotlight event on the 2nd of July, so 10 days later, to talk about the working group's recommendations. So you will soon be sent a link to join for that conversation, entirely focused on the IPP, just continuing to be sort of the single greatest stain on our justice system. Thank you very much to our wonderful panel of Andrew, Tim and Kelly. You can't all clap, but I'm going to clap. Thank you. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us and to share your thoughts. Please do stay in touch. As Andrew said a number of times, it's early days. We don't quite know yet what's going on, but we look forward to working with you to try to hold the government to account, to come up with the most impactful, progressive approach to sentencing review. Otherwise, we are going to lose this once in a lifetime opportunity, once in a generation opportunity to reform prison. And I think that there seems to be a collective concern that opportunities may well be slipping through our fingers. So we will be doing all we can to hold the government's feet to the fire on it. I wish you all a very nice afternoon and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.